Are with rigidity. There we are. And welcome everybody to a community spotlight with Brandon, also known as Rigidity. He does work with CNI. However, today we're going to focus on one of his personal projects, and that is a new programming language to use in Chia. It is called Ru, and it is seen as almost a matchup with Chia Lisp that'll compile down to the on-chain language. If anybody has questions, please do use the Zoom Q&A in order to ask them. For anybody who is watching on YouTube, feel free to jump into our Discord server and ask your questions in the community feedback channel. We have a link to that in the general channel in Discord as well. YouTube is not monitored for any questions, so please do ask them either in Zoom or in that Discord channel. Thank you for that. Without further ado, we're going to go ahead and dive into Ru, the language. So, Brandon, if you don't mind, what inspired you to create the Ru language? And what were kind of the primary pain points that you might have identified with Chia Lisp?
I guess the short answer to that is parentheses. The longer answer is it can be a bit time consuming to learn Lisp, and it's quite a bit different than languages that people are used to. So I think that that is one of the main reasons that I wanted to make a new language. But the sort of the key things that I liked about Chia Lisp were that it is a functional language and it's considered pure, which means that there is no state that's shared between variables. You can't modify a variable after it's been created, and every time you run the program, it will have the same output consistently. So I kind of wanted to take those same principles and make a language with syntax that people might be more familiar with, as well as adding a strict type system so that when you are writing code, you can't make easy mistakes like thinking that a variable is a string and it's really a number or something like that.
Yeah, that definitely sounds beneficial and helps to protect from a lot of those errors. And I know that in CNI, there's been a lot of great development and redesign of Chia Lisp, as well as new features being added. And it kind of seems like a great coupling with what you're building with Ru as well, trying to build out that more refined language. So definitely great to have another option for the developers out there. Now, before we get too much into it, where's the best place for people to contact you regarding the Ru language and also find out more about the Ru language?
Mhm. On the ru-ling.com website, I have a link to my Discord server where you can join in and ask questions about it. And there's also the GitHub if you want to check out the code base or submit a formal issue there, or even a pull request if you have changes you want made.
Thank you very much. Now, at a very high level, can you provide an overview of the Ru language syntax and its key features?
Mhm.
Kind of what sets it apart?
Um, so I would say the syntax is closer to a combination of Rust and TypeScript. So uh, it's a pure functional language still, but it sort of emulates being closer to a language like Rust, where you can define variables with the let keyword. You can write functions that are block scoped, meaning you have like curly braces to define the contents of a function, and you can sort of like nest scopes lexically, and variables from the outside can be accessed from the inside, which is something that GLisp doesn't have right now. Um, in GLisp, if you have a one scope that's inside of another, like for example, a function inside of a module, you can't access the module's variables from within the function. If you had a function inside of a function in Ru, you could access the outer variables from within the inner one, and it would sort of capture them into the local scope. So that's one thing that sets it apart. And then it has if statements. So in GLisp, everything is an expression. So if you wanted to do an if, you would have to right? Like if the condition, then the first branch, and then otherwise the else branch. And if you wanted to do that multiple times, you'd have to like nest them inside of each other, which can get a bit indented. And indentation is best kept low, in my opinion. So um, there's like an if statement construct which lets you say if this thing, then return this value. That way you can do like an early return, and it will still at the end of the day compile down into an expression since everything in CLVM is one. Um, but it sort of makes the development experience nicer. Um, there's also like assert statements and various other things like that to make developing in root easier than without them.
Thank you, thank you. Yeah, and just a quick recap is Rue is obviously not meant to supersede or deprecate Chia Lisp. It's supposed to be compatible with Chia Lisp and then also compatible with the core Chia blockchain itself. Can you just describe what it means to have two different languages that can both operate on the Chia blockchain and how that works?
Yep. So on the Chia blockchain, there is a virtual machine called CLVM, which stands for Chia Virtual Machine. And this is sort of a very simplified language compared to Chia Lisp. It has various opcodes that you can execute, and it doesn't have any concept of functions. There's like a lower level primitive called the environment. And so it's not really friendly to work with. So Chia Lisp was built on top of CLVM, and it compiles down to CLVM, and lets you write code in like a more developer friendly way. And so Ru is just another language that has a compiler that converts it from Ru into CLVM. So it's going through the same process or a similar process as GLisp. So while might not have the exact same output, they still compile down into a language that the blockchain can understand.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, that definitely helps a lot. And I know a lot of people might have been confused otherwise to see what might have looked like competing languages and figure out how they fit together. And going a little bit more into that compilation process, what is the actual compilation process from Ru down to CLVM? And can you go a little bit more in depth about how it handles optimizations and error checking?
Mhm. It's a lot more complicated than you might expect. So at the at the starting point is your source files, like the text file with Ru code in it. And when you're processing that file, you first need to run it through the lexer, which takes the text and converts it into a series of tokens, which are sort of like groups of characters that represent different things, such as a left parenthesis or an identifier or a number. And once you have that stream of tokens for a file, you can feed it into the parser, which then takes those tokens and makes a tree of the source file. So you might have like this is a function, this is a parameter, this is the body of the function, this is an if statement. It's like more high level syntax of the language. And then once you have that abstract syntax tree, as it's called, you can pass that into the compiler, which then takes the AST and converts it into the HIR. And the HIR stands for high level intermediate representation. This is where things like types are resolved. So it'll first declare all of the types that are defined, which means adding them to the scope that they're defined in. And then once everything has been declared, it will compile them. So it'll go through and actually create the types, create the HIR nodes, and create values, and then it will perform type checking on those values. So if you have a type called integer and you're trying to assign a string to it, it'll say, hey, you can't do that. And once you have built that HIR for the whole program, you can then check, is there any errors, and display them to the user if there is. Otherwise, it goes through another process called lowering, where it first builds a dependency graph of all of the scopes in the program. It will make sure that there aren't any circular references between constants, and then it will check which variables need to be included in which scopes and which can be optimized out. So if there's a variable that's not used or is only used once, it might be removed or inlined accordingly. Um, Once you've built that dependency graph, you can lower the HIR into the MIR, which is the mid-level intermediate representation. Um, that just boils it down into something closer to what CLVM can understand. You start building out the environments instead of the scopes and taking higher level primitives like the if statements and converting them down into expressions. And then once you have the MIR, you pass it through the optimizer, which then creates the LIR. The LIR is the low level intermediate representation, which then is pretty much exactly what CLVM is. It's just a nicer way of representing it in code. And then it will compose them and start optimizing them as it goes recursively. So if it has, let's say, an if statement where the condition can never be true, it will just optimize that out and only have the else branch. Um, if you have a, if you repeat like first of rest of a value, it'll convert that into a path. It will just start to do like all these optimizations on the output, and then finally you'll be left with a single LIR node for the whole program, which you can then pass into the code generator and generate the CLVM output for.
Man, that is definitely a lot of different layers and processes that work through there. And obviously, you have a great grasp on how it's going through the entire system to get from this high level language all the way down to CLVM. So, definitely excellent there. But I know some people might be a little inundated with that entire process. We do have a question inside of the Q&A, and I'd like to turn to that because it's directly at this point as to are there any examples of common CLSP, CLVM, CHILISP virtual machine code in Ru? Essentially, have you redone any of the CHILISP code in Ru that people can look at?
Yeah, so the repository has a set of examples that I've written so far that are currently possible to compile with Ru. And they sort of like emulate existing puzzles that are written in CHILISP while not producing the same output. And I wouldn't rely on them in production. They are very unstable, but they are good examples on how Ru can do sort of similar things that you can do in CHILISP. Like there's a pay to delegated or hidden puzzle, which is the standard transaction. There's a royalty split example. There is the singleton rewritten in Ru, and some simpler examples like factorials or like a hello world. And then there's the entire cat puzzle also written in Ru. Um, so there's a few examples like that.
I know those will definitely help people to grasp the new language concept, and especially those who are already experienced with Chia Lisp and the virtual machine, being able to grasp how Ru fits within that whole puzzle as well. So thank you very much for taking the time to build out those examples and include them inside of that code base. The next question we have is also tuned towards that interaction between ChiaLisp and Ru. And is it possible to convert ChiaLisp to Ru, at least partially?
Hmm Not currently. I might in the future provide a way to write code in Ru that would produce the same output as a cheeless program, but currently there is no way to do that. Once I had a method of doing that, I would also create a transpiler between Ru and cheeless so that you can convert them between the two. But I currently don't have a plan to do that right now.
Thank you. Thank you. And definitely sounds like something that a community member might be able to assist with in the future if anybody's interested in helping you to develop. Now, another question on potential future plans. Are you planning to include some form of a simulator inside of the Ru code base so that people can test these things out?
You can run the code locally on your command line right now. If you mean like a simulator as far as the blockchain or okay. Um, yeah, I would imagine that I could integrate it with my Sage wallet in the future so that you could sort of test it against an actual node and deploy your puzzles that you're testing on testnet and then spend coins with them. There's also the topic of debugging, which that sort of ties into. Um, GLisp has something called CLDB, which is a debugger for GLisp where you can change the way that it's compiled in order to get some more information at runtime when debugging it. So that's something that I'm probably going to look into supporting for Ru. And I also want to just add an interpreter for Roo as well, so that you don't have to run it on the CLVM or Cheeless virtual machine directly. You can just execute the Roo code itself, and that will give you much better error reporting when trying to work on a puzzle.
That's excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I want to go a little bit more back into the technical deep dive, if you will. And to this end of the different puzzles you've created and the different data structures, and you're doing them based off of types, how does Roo handle complex data structures and operations when compared to GLisp? And I know we touched on this briefly, but a little bit more detail might help.
Mhm. Yeah, so in Lisp, or specifically to Lisp, every value is either a cons pair or a an atom. Um, so you can create a pair by just using the C operator with two values. But if you wanted to have like a list of items, there's a macro in GList called list, which will take a list of values and just create that cons pair chain for you. So in Roo, you can do a similar thing. You can just use square brackets in order to define a list. Um, but that doesn't really get across the semantics of what that value is supposed to be. So let's say you have a condition type, which is like the create coin condition or agsigme or whatever condition you want. You could treat them all as lists of values, but then if you wanted to later say, is this a create coin condition? And if so, what is the memo inside of it? That's something that's pretty common that you'd want to do in GList. And usually what you have to do is just chain together like F and R, which is first and rest, to like extract individual values within a list, which can get pretty tedious to do. And if you get it wrong, you might be extracting the wrong value from the list, or it might be the wrong type, and just a kind of a recipe for disaster, in my opinion. So uh, in Roo, I created a type system that can handle that with semantic types, and one of them is just a simple struct. So you can define a struct called create coin, for example, and you can have the opcode be 51. You can have the puzzle hash is bytes 32. The amount is an integer, and the memos is either null or a pair between a list of bytes or and null. That way you can perfectly describe what a create coin condition is in the type system. And then if you wanted to extract the memos, you just say like condition.memos and it will give you the correct value. And so as well as that, there's the union types, which allow you to say it's either this type or that type. Um, then you can use type checking, like, is this null in order to determine if it's null at runtime. And if it isn't null, then you can use the value of the memos, for example. Um, Now there's also enum types, which are used for conditions. So instead of saying, a condition is either a create coin condition or an agsig condition or a reserve fee and so on, you can just define an enum with all of those variants inside of it. And then you can check what type of condition it is at runtime. So you can say condition is create coin, and then it will allow you to change what code you run depending on what type of condition it is. And all of that is type safe, so at runtime, it'll actually perform the necessary checks needed to make sure that the value you have is correct.
Yeah, that's excellent for sure, and great for all of the error handling that you've already baked into it to help protect from any of those errors.
Mhm.
Now, a little bit higher level as well, we have a question about what cost means in CLVM and to the Chia blockchain itself. Do you mind doing a high level overview as to what cost means in the Chia world?
Mhm. Yeah, I think it's a pretty confusing term, given that one might expect that it means a fee. It's tightly related to a fee as well, which makes it even more confusing. So the cost of a program is a combination of a variety of factors. The first one is every single byte in the puzzle or solution of a coin spend has a cost of 12,000. And this is just like a unit that represents how much resources it takes to store and run that program. So every byte is 12,000 because when you put it in the database, it has to store all of those bytes for the rest of time, which is expensive. Um, so that's one of the costs. Now, every condition has a cost. Most of them are zero, but the create coin condition and agsig conditions have a cost in the millions. Like I believe for each coin is around 18 million. I could be wrong. Um, yeah, so every condition that your program outputs can contribute towards the cost as well. And that's often a lot of the cost. And then when you run a program, which is the part that's more relevant to Rue, every single operator that gets executed has a cost. And that's based on how much memory it's working with, um, which operator it is, like some are more expensive, and how many arguments you pass to it. And that is designed to prevent a really computationally expensive program from causing a node to stall or to take a long time to execute it, for example. And so it's not directly, it's not the fee directly, but it is used in a calculation for how much fee to use based on how much activity there is in the mempool. So I would say a good estimate for the things that I've been doing is you pay like 5 mojos per cost. Um, it's not always going to be perfect, but it's a decent estimate.
Thank you, thank you. And I know if anybody's interested in seeing some more of the standard cost for the Chia Lisp to Chia Lisp virtual machine, we do have a document on the docs.chia site, which covers a number of those standard costs, such as what does it cost to create an NFT, create an NFT without DID, and then also what that relates to for a minimum fee, which as Brandon identified is that 5 mojo times that cost level. Now, keeping in mind this concept of cost, have you done any comparisons as to differences in cost for a Chia List program versus the same program in Rue? You mentioned you've already redone like the standard transaction and other puzzles along those lines.
Mhm. I haven't focused too much on that because I am still trying to get the language to work. But I have done a couple experiments to see what a puzzle written in Rue would compare to the same puzzle written in Chealisp. And if I remember correctly, the cat puzzle was around 70% of the cost when written in Chealisp. So it's a good amount more expensive to run the same puzzle in Rue. And that's just because I haven't focused too much on the optimization on the language yet. It's something that I can improve over time. Right now, it's still in beta, so it's not really a focus.
Yeah, completely understandable for sure. And it's great you've already done some of those early checks as to what those cost differences would be. Now, looking at that and looking at the developer convenience that's essentially created with Rue to eliminate those additional parentheses, add in the typing. How does Rue balance the need for that developer convenience with the security and efficiency requirements of the smart contracts on a blockchain?
Mhm. Um, well, I would say that one thing that I could have done, which some people might have preferred, is being able to define mutable variables and sort of modify them throughout the execution of the program. And I think it's important to not have that ability so that when you read what a program does, you can be confident that you understand everything about it without having to inspect where it's being mutated from, for example. So that's one thing that I think contributes to it being secure, or at least more auditable. I think that's part of what causes a lot of the vulnerabilities in Ethereum, as far as I'm aware. Um, I would say that there are certain aspects that might be a bit um, that might make it a bit harder to understand what's going on under the hood since you aren't having to write out all of the code manually. It's sort of generating some of the code for you. Like when you check if something is a certain type, it is generating code under the hood to actually do that check at runtime. And instead of seeing that code in front of you, you only sort of see the check that you're trying to do. So if you already made some assumptions about what the type is previously, it might not be doing a sufficient number of checks on that type. So an example of this is the cat2 vulnerability that called cat bleed, where the cat1 puzzle essentially um, checked the coin ID of the program against the actual coin ID on chain by passing in the three parts of a coin ID, the parent coin, the puzzle hash, and the amount. and it sort of just hashed them together and then compared that with the coin ID. And the problem there is that if you modify the solution to have a longer parent coin ID and a shorter um, puzzle hash, then you can sort of manipulate what the value of the amount is without actually changing the coin ID that's calculated. And the solution there is just to check the length of the two parameters to see are these actually 32 bytes long. And that wasn't done in the original puzzle. So in Roux, if you were to just assume that those parameters that are passed in are bytes 32 and bytes 32, you would end up with the same result, even though it seems like it's type safe, because you're assuming that the two parameters are already 32 bytes long. So the more secure way to write that would be to say they're bytes, not bytes 32, and then you have to explicitly run that check in order to use the type to calculate the coin ID. Um, so that's the kind of thing where you could end up believing that it's secure because of the types, and it's actually not doing the checks that it needs to do because it already assumes that it's the right type. Um, so I think that uh, adding some tooling to help remind people to actually check the input types would be a good idea in the future. But yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. A great overview, and I appreciate you adding in the Cat 1 example as well to kind of show how these things are affected in the real world and how that coding language leads to it. Now, you took a lot of time to discuss the efficiencies that are within the code base itself and how it is a little bit more developer friendly in some cases. What are some of the learning curves for developers who want to transition from Chia to Roo or start using both of them?
Um, I would say that you'd have to, I mean, I would assume that most people are already familiar with the overall syntax since it's more similar to something like TypeScript. So that wouldn't be as much of an issue. I think that learning the um, learning the type system would be important and making sure that you understand pure functional programming, which if you're already using TLSP, you should. Um, I mean, a lot of the same design principles still apply. Like you still have recursion, you still have immutability, you still have cons pairs and lists and all the same kinds of things. But you kind of have to start thinking about how you can actually structure the code to be more type safe when using Roux. Since if you just try to treat everything as a dynamic value, you're going to have a more painful time than you would in Shieldless.
Yeah, completely understandable for sure. And thank you. And it's great to see the focus on types to be able to help in the long run, even if it creates a little bit more of a learning experience or learning curve from the get-go. Now, for those of us who are just joining us, we're about halfway through the community spotlight with Rigidity, also known as Brandon. He is discussing his Roo programming language that'll interact on the Chia blockchain and compile down to CLVM. If you do have any questions for Brandon, feel free to add them into the Zoom Q&A. And if you are watching on YouTube, feel free to jump into our Discord server and add any questions to the community feedback channel. We do not monitor YouTube for any questions, so please do use one of those two other sources. I want to touch a little bit more on the learning curve and different plans you might have to bring developers into the Roo language in order to utilize it. Do you have any training resources currently or tools that are planned for the future in order to help different developers learn about the Roo language?
Hmm. Yeah, I'd say it's a bit sparse right now since it's still in beta, but the ruling.com website, sorry, Roo-ling, um, it has some documentation on how to install the command line and the language server for VS Code, as well as some examples and explanations of various concepts in the language. Um, it is not complete by any means, but I am working on it periodically. And I would say reading the examples in the repo would be a good starting point as well. I am working on the command line to make it as useful as possible for compiling and running the programs. Um, but I think in the future, having debugging support, the ability to interpret programs directly, um, and unit testing and things like that would be a very welcome improvement for the developer experience, as well as the simulator, like you mentioned, being able to actually test your code against the blockchain without having to go through like 10 different steps to write the program, compile it, serialize it, hash it, and create a coin, create a spend bundle, spend the coin. Like it's a lot of different steps to actually test this out. So I think reducing the number of steps with a command line tool would be really helpful.
Yeah, most certainly. Thank you. Thank you. And kind of to that end, what is on the roadmap for Rue? What are you looking at for the future other than debugging tools and helping more with these standard puzzles or examples?
Mhm. Um, right now, I am still focusing on sort of redesigning certain parts as needed to fix bugs that I'm running into along the way. Like right now, there's an issue where uh, inline functions aren't being compiled properly in some cases. So there's still a lot of like really problematic issues with the actual language right now. So I'm trying to solve those before I scope creep too hard. Um, I do like to scope creep though, so I have a lot of plans for like the standard library, adding a bunch of utilities to that so that you don't have to redefine them. I plan on adding a module system where you can define multiple files and import them. This would be similar to how it works in Rust, where you could make an entire project with a bunch of modules and you could have public and private exports, and uh, you can create libraries. Like I plan on having an actual package manager where you can publish a library and then you can depend on that, similar to Cargo. Um, so it's a lot of work. So I'm trying to tone down the amount of things that I have planned because I've already planned too much.
Yeah, completely understandable. And it's funny you mentioned the scope creep comment. I know that we actually had a comment in Discord specifically about that, and it sounds like Rue purposefully supports scope creep. Another question I have though is you obviously are undertaking a lot here. There's a lot you want to build out. There's a lot that still can be done to improve that developer experience and the learning resources. How can the community help? What are some things that you would want help from the community developers in order to improve this language and bring it to that next level?
Yeah, I'd say the first and foremost thing would be if you could just try it out and let me know if you run into any issues or have any feedback on the language, that would be huge. I don't think many people have actually tried it yet. But as well as that, writing documentation would be really helpful if anyone wants to take a stab at that. You can work on examples or even code under the hood of the compiler since it's all open source. Although there be dragons, so your mileage may vary.
Yeah, thank you. I think that'll give the community a good direction to go. And to touch on the dragons aspect there, do you mind overviewing some of the current shortcomings of Rue and what are your plans to resolve them?
Yeah, so I mean, there were some issues with the type system that I just tackled where it didn't correctly model how things are represented in CLVM, and it wasn't very flexible. So I spent time to rework that into something that's closer to the low-level types that you might expect, and then I built semantic types on top of that. And right now, I'm focused on uh, the HIR and dependency graph. Are there's a bunch of issues with inline functions specifically, because there's certain things in place to prevent you from having a stack overflow when you have things that are recursive, and those are causing issues with inline functions. And so there's a bunch of like errors that are being created or like internal compiler errors that are um, they're bugs. Like I need to fix them. So that's the main thing I'm working on right now. Um, I would say that. Uh, Like the parser is very unrefined. It gets the job done, but the moment you make any sort of typo in your code, it will have like a smattering of errors down your file, which is not ideal. So things like that. I think that's why it's in beta right now. I don't want to have people go through that if they are expecting a solid production ready language. It'll sort of be worked out over time before it's released.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. And just to kind of recap what you're doing and how much time you get to invest in this, you're a CNI employee and obviously do a lot of work for CNI, but this is strictly a personal project, and it's not your only personal project. I know we had you on last month to discuss your Wallet SDK, and in the call today, you even mentioned different things about your Sage wallet that you're building out. Are these kind of the main focuses? What is your time allocation looking like for this project, and what is the frequency of updates that people can expect on the Rue language itself?
It takes a lot of work on all of these projects. Like they're all projects that realistically could each have a team of people working on them, and it would still be a lot of work. So that is why they're moving at the pace they are. And like I wish Sage was moving along faster. I recently did some work on that as well, but I think that if I had like I don't have enough time to work on all of these full time. So it's sort of as I get free time, I'm pretty much working on one of these projects. And that's about it. I don't really have any other um things I do in my free time. So
Yeah, definitely very exciting. And I know everybody's seen a lot of the things you've done throughout the Chia ecosystem, whether it be from other wallets that you've been working on to work you've done within CNI to all of these side projects that you've been involved in as well. So I know that that's a great thing for the community, and you're definitely a great community member in addition to being an employee within CNI. So definitely cool to see the two hats there and how well your projects are all intermingling with one another. I want to open it up to you. If anybody else does have questions, feel free to add them into the Zoom Q&A or into our Discord community feedback channel. Otherwise, Brandon, I want to open it up to you. And why do you want to develop so much in Chia? What is the passion behind all these projects, and where does it come from?
I really believe in the future of Chia and the technology. The moment I saw it, I was like, wow, this is amazing. Like the things you can do with Chia Lisp and now Roo are really incredible. Like there's the fact that it's a Turing complete language and that you can do so many things with the conditions language in CLVM. There's just a lot of projects that I foresee myself wanting to develop on Chia, and so I'm sort of trying to build the infrastructure that I would use to write those projects. There's also a lot of pain points that I've had in when using Chia, so I wanted to sort of try to solve those issues myself instead of just complaining about them. Um, but I'd say that that is why I am still working on this stuff. Why I got so interested in it to begin with. Um, that's a good question. But here I am.
No, I think it's a great answer too, and really appreciate all your contributions in the space. Now, I know we've touched on a lot of very deep technical aspects throughout the conversation today. Is there anything else that you want to bring up to the community? Any other hot points about the Rue language or your other projects that you have been thinking about and just want to get out there?
Um, I don't know. I would say that, Rue it's definitely not stable right now. So uh don't go out there and expect it to be able to like build an actual smart contract and use it yet. But if you want to try it out, I would really love to hear what you think. I've just really enjoyed making this language. I have some updates I'm working on with Sage, and I think that it's getting closer to being released. So you'll hear more about that soon. Um, but yeah, that's all I have to say.
Thank you. Thank you. And we had one last question pop up inside of our Discord for now. We are going to be accepting a few more questions here, so feel free to add those into either the Discord community feedback channel or the Zoom Q&A. The question we just had come up though is regarding languages similar to Lisp or Ru. I know you already mentioned that the syntax of Ru is a little bit more like TypeScript, but do you mind just kind of going back to that syntax question as to a high level overview of similar languages?
What do you mean by? That
Like Chia Lisp is a stepchild, if you will, of Lisp itself, going all the way back and having a bunch of parentheses. And Ru is a little bit like TypeScript. Is there any other languages out there that would be akin to either one of them?
hmm. Um, I would say that Ru probably takes more from Rust, and it takes sort of the type system from TypeScript. It has like a concept called duck typing, where if it walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Um, so if you have a variable that is one type and you're trying to assign it to another type, if those types are similar in that they have the same representation in CLVM, then you can cast them from one to the other. So that's something that it took from TypeScript. Uh, I would say that the syntax for declaring those types is very strongly inspired by Rust. Um, I mean, the function keyword is derived from Kotlin. I don't know if that's really that important though. I just like how you say fun whenever you write a function. Um, I don't know. A lot of it is actually unique because the way that CLVM works is pretty different from how like a traditional runtime, like the Java runtime or even just machine code would work. Frankly, I don't have any experience writing like a traditional compiler, like a C compiler or anything like that. So I'm sure a lot of it is different because I don't have much experience with the traditional way of doing it, but also different in that it has to be written differently because it's CLVM, not machine code. So a lot of the things that you might be used to are not the case. Like you can't just check if something is an instance of a class because there are no classes in CLVM. So whenever you check the type, you're actually checking the value at runtime to see what structure it has. Like if a parameter is a list or an atom, or if that atom is a certain length or things like that. So that's one way it differs. It uses something called type guards, which are basically if you have done a type check like that, you check like, is this value an integer? Then inside of that scope, you can treat it as an integer instead of the original type. Um, that's another thing that it derived from TypeScript. And that allows you to do things like that you couldn't do directly in Rust, which are like passing enum variants around as an individual type, or if you check the a condition is a create coin condition, you can now just access create coin fields on that type. You don't have to destructure it into a new type or a new value to use those fields. So I think that it makes using the language a lot easier than some other languages that don't have that, but there are definitely things that are harder than other languages as well. I don't really have
Yeah,
any other direct inspirations for um, programming languages that it's inspired by. I I'd imagine it's just like a combination of everything that I've liked from languages I've used in the past.
absolutely, absolutely, and creates a nice streamlined way to interact with the Chia blockchain for sure.
Mhm.
And I'm going to go ahead and start wrapping up here. So if there are any last minute questions, please do add them into Discord or the Zoom Q&A. Otherwise, I just want to reiterate the different locations that people can find more information. So you did mention ruelang.com. That's RUE-LANG.com. And you can also find a lot of resources on the GitHub itself. I know personally I've been able to find it by just searching Rigidity Rue GitHub, and Google will bring it up as the first item right then and there. I'm sure we'll include some of these links in with the YouTube recording once that's published here next week. To turn it back to a call to action for the community members, I know you mentioned that they can help with documentation, but one of the first things that you're hoping people can do is just test out the language and provide their feedback. To that end, you've already included a number of examples, such as the standard transaction puzzle, the cat puzzle, and a number of other ones in there as well, like the singleton. But what are some very basic examples that somebody could create with the Rue language that might get them started?
Mhm. Yeah, there's another example in the repo called pay to conditions. This way back in with Arbor Wallet, the wallet puzzle was just this basically. It was a pay to condition puzzle where you pass in the public key when you're querying the puzzle, and then when you're solving it, you just give it a list of conditions, and then it makes sure that you've signed the conditions, and then just outputs them. That's like the simplest secure puzzle you can write for Chia, in my opinion. Um, Very simple. It's like nine lines of code, including the comment at the top. So I think that that would be a good starting point if you're trying to test out a coin with Roux. You can just compile that puzzle and then maybe modify it to do other things. Um, you could also try out the password coin example, although I'm starting to recommend that less since it's not exactly the most secure thing in the world. If you reveal the password on chain, then anyone can replace the spend with their own and use the same password, for example. Um, so I would recommend starting with the signature puzzle instead, but you can try that out for fun if you want.
Well, perfect. Thank you very much. And I know you're going to be available on your Discord server for Rue as well. So if anybody does have follow-up questions or needs help while they're working through the different examples, I'm sure you're going to be available for them in that regard also. What is your preferred interaction or contact method? Would you prefer people report bugs in the Discord server, on GitHub? Where would you like to interact?
Up to you. I mean, I'll respond pretty much anywhere. The If it's a formal issue with the compiler, I would say GitHub issues is probably preferable, but pretty much anything else, just the Discord is fine. I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Well, perfect. Well, thank you very much, Brandon. Also known in the community as Rigidity. Really appreciate you taking the time today. Thank you to all the participants who joined and asked the excellent questions. We always appreciate the engaging conversations, especially around the new developments going on within Chia. If any projects or individuals out there who are developing on Chia want to partake in one of these community spotlights in the future, feel free to reach out to myself, Clyde Wallace, directly in Discord, or even just send an email to our hello@chia.net email account, and we'll definitely arrange a time to have you involved and show off your project and start picking your brain about whatever it is you're developing. We have a couple of great upcoming events here. We Next week we're going to have an event with Bram, and it sounds like we might even have Dr. Nick on the call to discuss the new plot format. So keep an eye open for that. Definitely an engaging conversation and something that'll be a hot topic for the community for the next couple of years. But Brandon, thank you very much for your time today, and hope everybody here has a wonderful rest of their week.